Hey everybody, this is Mr. Mazzaro, and for today's lesson, I want to talk to you about a different benthic environment, sediment-covered shores. We already talked about rocky shores, which are shores, areas that are subject to tidal energy and covered with rock. But today, I want to talk to you about areas that are subject to tidal energy, shores that are covered with sand or that are covered with mud. And the first thing we have to answer is, okay, they're covered with sand and mud. Why? Why are some covered with sand and others covered with mud? What determines that? And then we have to answer, okay, so some are covered with sand, some are covered with mud. How are organisms adapted to live there? How do they stay wet? And how do they feed? Or really, what's the difference between the organisms on a sandy beach and a muddy salt marsh? So let's begin. Like I said, a sediment-covered shore is a shore that's covered with gravel, sand, silt, or clay. Sandy beaches and muddy salt marshes are the two types of sediment-covered shores. The big difference between sandy beaches and muddy salt marshes, aside from the fact that one's covered with sand and the other is covered with mud, is why one's covered with sand and the other's covered with mud. Areas with very, very strong wave energy, in other words, lots of tidal energy, tidal variation, those tend to be sandy beaches, whereas areas with less wave energy tend to be muddy salt marshes. Let's figure out why. If you take a look at the difference between sand and mud, what you'll notice is that gravel and sand are larger. And as a result, in an area with more wave energy, the smaller silt and clay and mud particles get washed away. And what you're left with is only sand. And as a result, sandy beaches are in areas with lots and lots of wave energy. Whereas in muddy salt marshes, areas with less wave energy, you still have that gravel and sand, but on top of that gravel and sand, the silt and the clay settle. So what you have is less wave energy, muddy salt marsh, more wave energy, sandy beach. How much wave energy determines what types of sediment covers a shore. Now, interestingly enough, you can actually extend this to the other lesson that you just had. If you have lots and lots and lots of wave energy, enough so that even you wash away your sand and your gravel along with your mud, what you're going to be left with then is a rocky shore. But again, we're not going to talk about those. We already talked about rocky shores. Now we're going to talk about sandy beaches and muddy salt marshes. And what determines the difference between them, the different sediments that covered them, is how much wave energy there is. On a rocky shore, organisms had to be differently able to resist drying out. Organisms resisted drying out either by running and hiding, sitting and bearing it, or clamming up. But on a sediment-covered shore, all the organisms basically just burrow to stay wet. This is the reason why when you walk onto a muddy salt marsh or a sandy beach and you look down, you don't see a lot of organisms because they're all below your feet. So if organisms don't differentiate themselves by how they resist drying out on a sediment-covered shore, how do organisms differentiate themselves on a sediment-covered shore? Well, in order to tell you that, I have to first start talking about the different zones of a sediment-covered shore. So here's a typical sandy beach, and sandy beaches have two basic zones to them. They have an upper beach and a lower beach. The upper beach has lots of myophonic and inphonic animals. Myophonic animals would be these guys, isopods and bristleworms, tiny, tiny, tiny little microscopic organisms that aren't really any bigger than a sand particle themselves. They don't burrow, they just kind of permanently live below the sand. In fact, when you're walking on a beach, what you're walking on is billions of myophonic animals you just don't even know, tiny little insects that live between sediment particles. On the upper beach, there's also burrowing clams and oysters and that sort of thing. In other words, inphonic or burrowing animals are on the upper shore. Whereas the lower beach, there are lots of epiphonic or above ground animals. Crabs, sea cucumbers, sand dollars, organisms that spend most of their day above the ground, not below it. Why? Because on the lower beach, it's wet for most of the time, so they don't need to burrow to stay wet. So one of the big differentiations on a sandy beach is where organisms live. Myophonic organisms that live between sediment particles, and inphonic, burrowing organisms, live on the upper beach because it's dry and that's how they stay wet. Organisms that live on the lower beach are usually epifaunic. They're above ground for most of the day. The big differentiation between organisms that live on sediment-covered shores and organisms that live on muddy salt marshes is how they eat. Organisms that live on sandy beaches are suspension feeders. You may call this filter feeding, but I'm going to stress that or try to get you not to call it filter feeding. And the reason is because if you start calling it filter feeding, my students tend to have trouble differentiating between this type of feeding and the next one I'm going to teach you about with deposit feeding. As a result, it's just easier if you just call it what it is, suspension feeding. Why is it called suspension feeding? Because these organisms are eating organic matter that's suspended in the water column. In other words, they're eating stuff that's floating around in the water, not stuff that settles on the ocean bottom. Why do organisms on sandy beaches tend to be suspension feeders? Well, there's two reasons. One, all that water energy that washed away all that mud and created a sandy beach also churns up the water, and churning water has more stuff floating around in it, so organisms can suck that stuff out and live. Also, sand's relatively big. It stays towards the ocean bottom. It doesn't float around in the water column like clay and silt, those smaller sediment particles. So, organisms can filter through the water pretty easily and not worry about their filter getting clogged with fine little dust and clay and silt particles. Muddy salt marshes are the next area, the next sediment-covered shore that we're going to talk about. And unlike sandy beaches, muddy salt marshes actually have 3 areas. We're only really going to focus on 2, though. The 2 main areas of a muddy salt marsh are the lower mud flat and a cordgrass area. The lower mud flat is down here. It's the lower part of a muddy salt marsh, and it's covered with mud. This area usually becomes completely covered with water during high tide, and that's why there's no cordgrass down there. If you remember, the only truly marine plant is seagrass. That's the only marine plant that can withstand being completely submerged at high tide. As a result, cordgrass usually doesn't become completely submerged, and if it were down here and it did become completely submerged, it would have died. And that's why this area is all mud and no plants. In the upper part of a muddy salt marsh, you have a cordgrass area. That's where cordgrass does live and does root in the soft mud. And the reason it lives up there, not down here, again, is because up here it's not going to be completely submerged during high tide, whereas down here it would. So cordgrass can live up here, not down there. The third area you don't have to write down, it's called a transition zone. It's an area that's basically a transition between an aquatic environment and a terrestrial environment. It's where you stop seeing cordgrass and start seeing trees. Recent marine science texts have basically even completely discounted this as a marine area anyway, just because there's terrestrial plants in it. So we're not going to talk very much about it at all. But it's the highest zone of a muddy salt marsh, and it's where you see mostly land plants. On a muddy salt marsh, you don't see suspension feeding. Why? Well, because if you tried to filter through the water of a muddy salt marsh, your filter would get clogged with mud, all that fine silt and clay that's floating around in the water column. Also, you have mud there, which means you don't have a lot of water movement to begin with, so there's not a lot of material suspended in the water column itself. Instead, on a muddy salt marsh, you have mostly deposit feeders. These are organisms that literally suck food off the ocean bottom itself, in this case, off the muddy salt marsh itself. Or organisms that go through the sediment and ingest whole mouthfuls of sediment and then just poop out dirt and digest whatever organic matter's in there. Most of your food on a muddy salt marsh has settled on the ocean bottom, so organisms are going to go there to eat. And these organisms that suck food off the ocean bottom or go through the sediment themselves, they're called deposit feeders, organisms that eat food that's deposited on the ocean bottom. These organisms aren't, like sandy beach organisms, what are known as suspension feeders, organisms that eat food that's suspended in the water itself, not settled on the ocean bottom. So that's it for this lesson on sediment-covered shores. We talked about the two types of sediment-covered shores, sandy beaches and muddy salt marshes. And we also talked about why some are covered with sand. Those would be lots of wave energy that washes away all the mud and silt and clay. And others covered with mud because there's less wave energy. And those areas, the mud settles on top of the sand layer. We also talked about how you get a rocky shore if you have a tremendous amount of wave energy that even washes away the sand and the gravel. Then we talked about how if you're an organism on a sediment-covered shore, you're going to stay wet basically by burrowing. So we needed to have different ways of differentiating organisms that live on sediment-covered shores. So the way we really differentiated them was how they eat. Organisms on a sandy beach eat by suspension feeding, eating material out from the water column itself, whereas organisms on a muddy salt marsh are typically deposit feeders. Organisms that suck food off the ocean bottom or actually ingest whole mouthfuls of sediment and then spit out the non-organic matter, the mud and silt, and digest whatever rotting material might be in there. All right, guys, that concludes the lesson on sediment-covered shores. The next lesson is going to be on coral reefs, and I look forward to talking to you then.